have said that in the whole history of warfare, it's highly unlikely there has been a war before where in such a dense area, which is completely booby-trapped, and much more by Hamas in the 18 years they ran Gaza, that in very few, if not no occasions in the history of war, has civilian casualty to terrorist death been so low, that it is roughly one terrorist to one civilian dead. Now, if that means it's 15,000 Hamas terrorists killed, maybe that means there are 30,000 Palestinians killed. This is terrible, terrible. But this is the war that Hamas started, and they didn't have to start the war. And the accusation that Israel would be deliberately targeting children is another of the outrageous smears. The third one you gave, just remind me quickly, was...
The second one was genocide. The third one was the
genocide, again. Genocide was what Hamas attempted on the 7th of October, when 4,000 of their terrorists, along with Islamic Jihad, broke into Israel, went into innocent people's homes and burned them alive in their homes, and went through the Nova music party of young people simply dancing in the early hours of the morning and raped and murdered their way through that party. That was an attempted genocide. By the way, Hezbollah were meant to do the same thing from the north, and thank goodness Hamas and Hezbollah weren't able to communicate. It's something I go into in the book. Weren't able to communicate to make sure that it was coordinated. If it had have been exactly the same thing would have come from the north. As it was, Hezbollah didn't have the advance notice and they just joined in with rocket fire from the 8th. But the genocide was what Hamas and their allies want to commit. Genocide is what their backers, the Iranian Revolutionary Government in Iran, say they want to carry out. If Israel had wanted to commit genocide in Gaza...
Douglas Murray shreds the new media circus, where frauds who whitewash Hitler get a global loudspeaker, but basic facts are gatekeeping, apparently. They scream about so-called concentration camps, a vile lie meant to twist the Holocaust knife, about a place with shopping malls and a population that has doubled. This isn't journalism, it's stenography for terrorists. The real genocide was attempted on October 7th.
I like to use sometimes against the ignoramuses and cowards who use the terms like Islamophobia against anyone who cites this, which is, I like to say, and it's true, anyone who doesn't think there's a problem with radical Islam doesn't have enough Muslim friends. Because if they did, they'd know that. Because any Muslim knows that. Everybody knows that. Everyone in the Middle East knows that. I think people in the Middle East don't know the difference between trying to hold the country vaguely stable and it being run by Hamas or Hezbollah. Ask the people of Lebanon.
But I do want to ask about Joe Rogan, because you did do this interview of Rogan. He's been impersonating you. I don't think you've seen this clip, saying, "Have you been there?" Blah, blah. And this whole debate got very meta. You were arguing against the fact that he hadn't had enough experts on Israel, particularly, and Ukraine, and him and Dave Smith were sort of debating you on that. You've written about lots of topics, over the last couple of years: Islam, climate change, the Troubles, southern border, rise of China, Israel, JFK's murder, DEI, Christianity, and many more. I'm looking at your byline on various different newspapers. Some people would argue that you're not an expert on all of those things. So how does that contradict your point slightly?
No, not at all. No, I'm very careful about what I talk about and what I write about, and I make sure I write about and talk about the things I know about. I think that it's, furthermore, I think, I don't want to go on about it because it's rather boring, but I think that there seems to be some kind of misunderstanding, which is that what I was saying to Joe was new media has to a great extent supplanted old media. I think that Joe Rogan probably has a bigger impact than, say, the Washington Post these days, or certainly more impact than the Atlantic magazine.
Douglas Murray schools the clueless interviewer. He's a writer who researches, not some podcast god platforming any moron with a mic. With an audience rivaling legacy media for influence, Rogan's feigned ignorance isn't a debate. It's dangerously irresponsible. He wields the power of the Washington Post with the intellectual rigour of a stoned teenager. When the hell did we decide that was an acceptable trade-off?
And therefore, there's an interesting moment in the media landscape, which is old media made a lot of mistakes. There are a lot of reasons to distrust the New York Times, for instance. But just because old media has made mistakes does not mean there are absolutely no rules that do exist in media, and no, as it were, gates that do exist. A point I made there, which seems to have been lost, is if you're writing about a country, ordinarily you ought to know the country. For instance, you do not have the GB News Washington correspondent living in Liverpool. And there's a reason for that, which is that you simply can't cover DC politics unless you're in DC, at least on a pretty regular basis. That is totally normal. And when you're reporting on a war, and when you're writing about a war, it's perfectly normal. In fact, it is standard practice that you ought to have been to see the war and to know the region. And I'm slightly bewildered, though, there's so many people who think that's some kind of bizarre gatekeeping thing. People can say whatever the hell they want. I'm certainly not one to try to stop that. They can, as we all know, short of incitement to kill people and so on, free speech rights are very considerable, particularly in the United States. People can sound off all they want, but there are also some things that are true and some things that are not. And I do believe that if you have experience in a country, you are likely to know more about it than somebody who has absolutely no experience in the country.
Douglas Murray's point is devastatingly simple. Just because old media is flawed doesn't mean new media gets to be a fact-free circus. He's bewildered that basic standards, like actually visiting a country to report on it, are now controversial gatekeeping. It's journalism 101. Since when did we decide an opinion formed from 1,000 miles away is worth a single damn thing?
An obvious way I've said this since that discussion was Joe knows an awful lot about MMA fighting, I suspect more than you. And if you were to go on Joe's podcast and try to talk for 3 hours about MMA fighting, and it turned out you'd never been to a fight, and you didn't know the rules, and you'd actually just read about Wikipedia reports of some MMA rules, and you kept getting it wrong, he would call you out on it. And my simple suggestion was, why not do this on very, very important things bigger than a fight? And the one that stood out, or the two that stood out to me were, three, keeps growing, were wildly unbalanced guest choices in regard to the war in Ukraine, wildly unbalanced guest choices in relation to the war in Gaza and Israel, and thirdly, the wild misrepresentation of 20th century history by pseudo-historians who are just regurgitating a type of history that was debunked many years ago and never had any mainstream purchase. In which, by the way, in that third one, there is something that maybe British people like us feel particularly sensitive about, but for good reason, which is that I can't bear seeing some of these guests who are doing the rounds on some of the podcasts in the US, right-wing podcasts, pretending that Hitler wasn't all that bad and that the great villain of the 20th century was Winston Churchill. No, no, no. When they were coming for Churchill from the left, I wrote about this in my book, The War on the West, the people who were doing that were doing it for a specific reason. And people like me opposed them because they were misrepresenting history and they were trying to rob the British people of one of our great heroes. Well, it's the same thing when they try to do it from the right.
Douglas Murray's devastating MMA analogy exposes Rogan's joke of a standard. You can't be ignorant about cage fighting, but you can be a pseudo-historian regurgitating pro-Hitler garbage. With 11 million listeners per episode, according to the New York Times, this isn't a podcast. It's a global loudspeaker for dangerous debunked lies. When did we decide historical truth was less important than a goddamn armbar?
They are trying to misrepresent history. They are misrepresenting Britain's story. They are misrepresenting one of Britain's great heroes. And I don't see any reason why it should happen without being contested.
Obviously, on the Joe Rogan podcast, Dave Smith and Joe Rogan argued against you on that point. They said that Darryl Cooper, the historian, or not historian, the commentator, I don't know how to describe him.
That's the thing, it's all shape-shifting.
Yeah, right. But they said that he wasn't making the points that you just said. They said
anyone can go online and see that I'm correct.
Okay. You couldn't remember his name, Darryl Cooper's name, when you went on the podcast.
It was a slightly deliberate signal of my
so you weren't unprepared.
Contempt.
Okay.
You really, I mean, you will understand, many people viewing will understand some of the landscape in the era of the new media is really fetid, and that's inevitable. But I believe that there are very many serious historians, not least very many serious British historians at the moment, whose work deserves serious attention. And I do not care to help promulgate the theories or big up the delusions of total fakes and frauds.
Do you not think it's interesting to at least have the debate about Churchill's legacy? I agree with you that Cooper,
We've had it for years.
But in many ways, Cooper, I think he misrepresents a lot of it, particularly what happens in the 1930s. But perhaps he makes some legitimate criticisms. And
okay, but perhaps if you look at the entrails of a chicken, you'll find something to tell you about the future.
Okay. Do you think that Joe Rogan has platformed anti-Semites?
I'm not going to get trapped on this. There are many people on that he's had that I dislike. I would like to see him simply have.
Douglas Murray refuses to debate frauds, rewriting history. It's like reading chicken entrails for truth. He won't dignify the names of fools who whitewash Hitler while savaging Churchill. With nearly 63% of young Americans unaware 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, according to the Claims Conference 2020. This isn't a discussion, it's malpractice. Why are we letting con men piss on the graves of heroes?
More of a balance of opinion. Right. But that's all I have to say.
But it's not about anti-Semitism itself.
It's about misrepresenting things that are going on in the moment. Again, if you invite somebody on who is playing a very dark game and trying to cover it over, I think that person should be challenged. I think that the choice of guests, the selection of guests matters. I mean, it's so frustrating that you're going down this road because all I'm arguing for is some kind of standard. And I know that expertise has let a lot of people down in recent years. I agree. I said repeatedly on that podcast, I agree. We had the conspiracy theory of the lab leak, which decimated public trust when we were told that this thing that we were told was conspiracy turned out not to be. We were talking earlier about the conspiracy theory of the Great Replacement and so on. Just because there are some things that are called conspiracies that turn out to be true does not mean that all conspiracy theories are true. And just because many experts have got things wrong does not mean expertise should not matter. Just because some journalists have got things wrong does not mean that journalistic standards should be completely thrown out of the window. It's a very straightforward claim I'm making. I would like to see it applied to the right as well as to the left.
By the way, I agree with you. There should be absolute standards, and I really wish that Joe Rogan puts Andrew Roberts on and talks about Churchill, and I'm glad that he had you on. I think that some people's criticism of you, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this, is that you spent so much time talking about his selection of guests that it had a whiff of sort of gatekeeping, or sort of trying to.
Well, that's another one, isn't it? That's not my problem. But
yeah.
Douglas Murray's not gatekeeping. He's demanding basic intellectual hygiene in a media sewer. His point is devastating. Just because experts blew the lab leak theory doesn't mean every crackpot deserves a megaphone. With 15% of Americans buying into QAnon insanity, according to PRRI 2021, this isn't about open debate. It's about polluting the public mind for clicks. When did thinking for yourself become synonymous with being a gullible idiot?
Or deplatforming?
Just because some people have done gatekeeping that has tried to keep out majority opinion from the mainstream does not mean you should lift every sluice in your society and let the sewage just run right through it.
Yeah, let's talk about the book. So, as I said earlier, I think my favourite book from you since The Strange Death of Europe. Absolutely brilliant. Millions of people in the West and Muslims and Western Muslims believe three things, and you talk about this in the book. Gaza is a concentration camp, Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians, and they believe that tens of thousands of children have been murdered by Israel over the last couple of years. Is there any accuracy to any of these 3 points? And how does one sort of persuade people who genuinely and sincerely believe that? Because I mean, you've probably interviewed them. I've interviewed people, left-wing people, radical Muslims, who are incredibly emotive and genuinely believe that Israel is committing some kind of genocide here.
The first thing is they should read my book, or any other book which is by somebody who's seen what I've seen, spoken to the number of people I've spoken to, survivors, families of hostages, people who witnessed Hamas's barbarism up close, and been with the IDF during their operations in Gaza and Lebanon to try to fulfill the 2 aims of Israel's war, which are to return the kidnapped hostages, many of whom are still in captivity as we speak, and secondly, to destroy the leadership of Hamas and make Hamas effectively operationally incapable. To take just those 3...
Gaza, a concentration camp? Get real. It's a terror statelet run by Hamas, a death cult prioritizing tunnels over hospitals. The Palestinian population has doubled since 1990, history's most incompetent genocide. Douglas Murray says read a book. But I say stop swallowing activist bullshit served on a platter of willful ignorance. When did repeating Hamas propaganda become a substitute for actually thinking?
Lies, which you cite. Anyone who knows what Gaza was like before October the 7th, 2023, it's a very different place now because of the choices that Hamas made. Anyone who knows anything about Gaza could tell quite a lot of tells of why Gaza in no way resembled a concentration camp, which is a deliberate smear which people use because they know that if you use the accusation concentration camp against the Jewish state, you will particularly wound and upset Jews. That's why they do it. That's why they don't say, you know, it's a shame that. Well, no, it's a shame that more food trucks can't come in. As it was, there's no shortage of food trucks, but that they can't come in without having to be searched because they have to be searched because of missiles. But we understand, or something like that. Gaza's population almost doubled from the time that every Jew was torn from their homes by the IDF in Gaza in 2005, and the whole territory given over to the Palestinian peoples, who then voted in Hamas. In the time from 2005, when every Jew was made to leave Gaza, because everybody seems to agree that one of the natural things for the Palestinians is that they can't have a single Jew near them. That seems for some reason to be a completely acceptable opinion. From the time the withdrawal in 2005 to October the 7th, 2023, the population of Gaza almost doubled. Even the people who make the outrageous claims about Israel's military actions and military response to the 7th of October, they can't reconcile in their heads the lies they're saying. For instance, they will say that the population of Gaza is disproportionately young. That does happen to be true, but you'll notice that you have a choice between those two things, don't you? Either it's a concentration camp, or it's a place where the population doubles and people are able to have a lot of children.
They scream concentration camp, a vile lie meant to twist the Holocaust knife. Douglas Murray obliterates it. Gaza's population nearly doubled since Israel left in 2005. The Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics itself. Some genocide, right? They even cry about a young population, which proves life, not death. This isn't about truth. It's about raw, manipulative hatred. Why do people fall for this bullshit?
You will notice that there was no doubling of the population in Bergen-Belsen in the 1940s. So it's one of the many reasons why it's totally obscene. The other reason is, by the way, that anyone who knows anything about Gaza between 2005 and 2023, and again I give many examples in the book, will know that actually compared to the rest of the region, other Arab countries in the region, other Muslim countries in the region, Gaza was pretty much like some of them actually living standards were higher in Gaza than some of their neighbors, and they had shopping malls and swimming pools and leisure centres and marketplaces and actually the strip along the beach was really a rather nice bit of town. Billions of dollars were poured into Gaza in international aid from other people in the region, by British taxpayers, American taxpayers, EU taxpayers and others. Billions of dollars were not poured in to Auschwitz in the 1940s. It's like, this is just obscene. You'll notice that people were not driving luxury cars around Treblinka in the 1940s. This is obscene. But as I say, people make that accusation because they want to wound the Jewish state. Concentration camp is a very good way to do that, by claiming that. The other two examples you give of disproportionately the death of children, certainly children will have been killed in fighting in Gaza, certainly. We cannot rely on the Hamas numbers which they give out, which are the only numbers that can be, which any of the Western media decide can actually be used. But the best analysts of the war from outside.
Murray shreds this by pointing to pre-war Gaza's shopping malls, swimming pools and luxury cars. Nobody was driving a Mercedes through Treblinka. Billions in Western aid poured into Gaza, not Auschwitz. Meanwhile, the media swallows Hamas-supplied casualty figures whole, numbers that even data analysts have shown to be statistically impossible. This isn't journalism, it's stenography for terrorists. When did we decide to outsource our brains to a death cult?
Have said that in the whole history of warfare, it's highly unlikely there has been a war before where in such a dense area, which is completely booby-trapped, was completely booby-trapped, and much more by Hamas in the 18 years they ran Gaza, that in very few, if not no occasions in the history of war, has civilian casualty to terrorist death been so low, that it is roughly one terrorist to one civilian dead. Now, if that means it's 15,000 Hamas terrorists killed, maybe that means there are 30,000 Palestinians killed. This is terrible, terrible. But this is the war that Hamas started, and they didn't have to start the war. And the accusation that Israel would be deliberately targeting children is another of the outrageous smears. The third one you gave, just remind me quickly, was...
The second one was genocide. The third one was the
genocide, again. Genocide was what Hamas attempted on the 7th of October, when 4,000 of their terrorists, along with Islamic Jihad, broke into Israel, went into innocent people's homes and burned them alive in their homes, and went through the Nova music party of young people simply dancing in the early hours of the morning and raped and murdered their way through that party. That was an attempted genocide. By the way, Hezbollah were meant to do the same thing from the north, and thank goodness Hamas and Hezbollah weren't able to communicate. It's something I go into in the book. Weren't able to communicate to make sure that it was coordinated. If it had have been exactly the same thing would have come from the north. As it was, Hezbollah didn't have the advance notice and they just joined in with rocket fire from the 8th. But the genocide was what Hamas and their allies want to commit. Genocide is what their backers, the Iranian Revolutionary Government in Iran, say they want to carry out. If Israel had wanted to commit genocide in Gaza...
Military analysts, not politicians, say the IDF has achieved a roughly 1-to-1 civilian-to-terrorist casualty ratio, a figure unheard of in a dense, booby-trapped urban hellscape. The actual genocide was attempted on October 7th, when 4,000 Hamas terrorists burned and slaughtered their way through Israeli homes and a music festival. So any thoughts on what Douglas Murray just discussed? Share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss any of our future debates.